and that should show no remorse. Crown prosecutor had a pretty unremarkable recent life. It's absolutely correct. The Crown also judge placed Andrea on the Chalmers route, saying, quote, there was no after that, things on sale, and it was out on sale prior to trial. He reminded the court that Andrea's sentence only on and not on anything to do with how he died. He also said that the thiefs were not victims. Quote, the victims were parents and the public. She didn't murder these children. The sentencing hearing of July 14, 2015, Judge Murray Thompson said each represented 6 separate offences. And that increased after the first offence. Said, quote, these were usually felonies. Said she had shown rapid offences and her involvement receiving others. He referred to section of the Criminal Code of Canada explaining the law against disclosing a woman remains in place to ensure that deaths can be investigated.
Yeah.
Did I just let the cable guys in?
No, I'm listening to a podcast.
Let the cable guys in, and they said that when they came yesterday, all the doors were locked. And they just went downstairs and into people's place and everything, and it was all unlocked.
Everything was unlocked?
Yeah.
From where?
I don't know. So
The door's always locked. Well, no, you don't need a. Do you need a key to get into people's place?
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't need
it's
a
not
key.
Unlocked.
Well, so you don't need a key to get in off of the kitchen. But down there,
And once you're down there.
that was like all the doors were open. So that, well, but that also means that the door to the furnace room, so I don't know if they left it unlocked.
Oh, okay.
So I said,
Yeah,
you
usually
need to lock the doors.
every single time I've been down there, every single door is locked. Every
Right.
single time.
So I
that's
don't know if they just didn't lock it then? Might have been.
Yeah.
Hey, did you know this was being discussed on
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. And Trina did a debrief with me and said that we were chosen as, our name came up several times as a charity to go for help. Like
Okay, Byron, can you hear us? Edmonton, can you hear us?
Cool. Okay,
Edmonton, can you hear us?
Oh,
Edmonton's not doing anything. Edmonton, can you hear us?
Weird.
Okay, Foothills, can you hear us? Hub, can you hear us? Good day. What about Edmonton?
Byron, can you please mute
Edmonton, can you hear us? Edmonton, wave, please. There goes somebody. Just to make sure we got Edmonton. Edmonton, can you hear us? Can they hear us? Edmonton? I did. I hate sound systems. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody today? It's a beautiful day. Spring has arrived, and it's going to be that way for a while, so we're grateful for that. So it's my great privilege to get to introduce Preston Manning this morning. I almost said Peyton. It almost came out wrong. We had some confusion. Well, some of the younger staff actually last week they were very impressed with me because I had Peyton Manning coming, and so I was like quite something there for about 5 minutes. But anyway, Preston Manning has devoted his life to public service as a founder of two federal political parties and leader of the official opposition in Parliament. He distinguished himself as an advocate for many Canadians through his commitment to democratic and political reform. Since retirement from politics, although I don't know that you've ever actually done that, have you? He has continued to support the development of public policy, the founding of his own organizations, the Manning Center and the Manning Foundation, as well as involvement with organizations such as the Fraser Institute and Canada West Foundation. While Preston is well known for his contribution to Canadian politics, he has always been involved in the faith community, and really why he's here today. Preston and his family are active evangelical Christians, have attended a variety of Christian fellowships over the years. Preston's lifelong interest in relating his faith to politics and to business and science culminated in his most recent book, which Taylor's trying to sell everybody a copy of, called Faith, Leadership, and Public Life. Does she get a percentage? That's what I want to know. Which connects relevant lessons from his years in Parliament and politics to lessons learned from faith leaders in both Christianity and Judaism. And it is my great privilege to introduce this morning Preston Manning.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. I tried to use that Peyton Manning thing too to get tickets to a Super Bowl. I was cousin Peyton, I told him, but it didn't work. But I do want to say thank you for the chance to visit with you. I'll be fairly brief, and then I think you and I, Stephen, are going to have a discussion so we can maybe get at some of the things you're particularly interested in and what I might be able to contribute on them. One of the things that I've been thinking about more and more is just how does one determine what one's work should be in the world as a Christian. And I think the basic principle, particularly when you're young, you do a lot of things on your own initiative. I think as you get a little bit older, you maybe understand that the key is to try to understand what God himself is doing, and then you joining in as distinct from you kind of initiating on your own. And the scripture passage that I was meditating on this morning, which I think captures this, in a way it's Jesus' most definitive work on, or words on that subject, when he said, "My Father is always at work, and I too am working." I've used this with my wife to justify being a workaholic. My Father is always at work. The Son can do nothing by himself, only what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. And I just think that's a very good guide to our own work as believers in the world. And then looking at Jesus' work, and a few of you were at the prayer breakfast, so maybe I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I see Jesus' work as occurring in two dimensions. The vertical dimension of reconciling people to God. And when he talked to Nicodemus, that was basically all he talked about. Unless you're born again internally from within, you can't keep these commandments that are supposed to solve relationships this way. But then he also operated in the horizontal dimension and reconciling relationships among people, his healing work, his feeding the poor, and of course his great story on the Good Samaritan, that love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the things I've observed in the faith community, particularly in Western Canada, we tend to get majoring on one or the other. We're either all on this dimension or all on this dimension. And I think one of the admirable things about the work of the mustard seed is that you have both. And I think the challenge is to how do you keep them both in balance? How do you meet and minister to these needs, obvious needs of people that are in this dimension? And then how do you also include that dimension? One of the historical things might interest you in terms of Western Canada, Calgary in particular. In the 20s and 30s, there were these two major streams that cut across they affected the political world as well as the religious world. There was the social gospel movement headed up by J.S. Woodsworth, who was a Methodist minister from Winnipeg. In fact, he left the Methodist Church because he didn't think they had enough of this emphasis. And the social gospel movement, the whole emphasis on the Christian faith was on delivering social services, dealing with poverty and things of that nature. And then here in Calgary, you had William Aberhart, who eventually became premier, but he was a strong evangelical. He pioneered religious radio and political radio broadcasting in Canada. He used to broadcast over old CFCN, the Voice of the Prairies. And he was all in this dimension. And of course, what some people have pointed out, if you put that dimension together with this dimension, you get the cross, which is really the balance of both of them. But as Depression deepened, Aberhart had an institute for training ministers on 8th Avenue here. In fact, where the old Holt Renfrew, or where the current Holt Renfrew building is on 8th Avenue, if you walk down there, one of their windows has got all the pictures from his institute. He raised money for it during the Depression by getting donations, $1 a brick, and he built brick by brick by brick and built this thing. That's how my father actually came to know Christ. He was raised on a homestead in Saskatchewan near Rosetown. He and his brother built one of these crystal radio sets back in the 20s, the early days of radio, and the first broadcast they heard was William Aberhart talk about the gospel from Calgary. And he came across to Calgary then to study for the ministry. But as the Depression deepened, at that time that institute was almost on the edge of downtown, and the guys that were riding the rails in those days, people were hopping on the freight cars and going from city to city looking for work, and they used to jump off the trains at that point there to avoid the CPR police downtown. They'd ended up at Aberhart's soup kitchen. So you had this evangelical guy that said it's all this direction, starting to have to do something in this direction, and he started to see in the lineups outside his soup kitchen. He was a high school principal, Crescent Heights High School. He started to see students that he'd sent off to hopefully to university or to be lawyers or doctors or business people, starting to see him in these lineups, and it broadened his perspective then that the Christian gospel is this direction, but it's this direction as well. And then there's a whole other story. He eventually got into politics in the Depression and ended up being premier, and my father followed him, and he ended up being premier for 25 years, but he came to Calgary to study the gospel under an evangelical ministry. The other point I'd make in this connection is that the central doctrine of both the social gospel and the evangelical perspective is reconciliation. Both of them are dealing with reconciliation. One in reconciliation of people to God, the other reconciliation to people to themselves. And it seems to me that as Christians, we ought to be authorities on the subject of reconciliation. How do you reconcile conflicting interests, whether it's between man and God or between people in society? And I'm a student of the scriptures. The whole Old Testament to me is a 400-year story of trying to reconcile relationships between people through the rule of law. I mean, the 10 Commandments, that was the way you were going to reconcile people to God, and that was the way you were going to reconcile people to each other. This is of particular importance if you get into politics, because the legislator, you get elected to the parliament as legislature here, one of the things you do is make laws. You're effectively the only people that can make statute law. So you better understand the nature of law, including the limits of law, what can be done and what can't be done. And to me, the lesson of the Old Testament on that is the latter-day prophets came up against the limits to what you can do through law, that unless you could inscribe the laws on the tablets of the heart as distinct from being on the tablets of stone or statute books, you couldn't reconcile people to God or to each other. And so then that points you to the New Testament, is Jesus' approach to reconciliation is fundamentally different than through the rule of law. It's a different approach, and it's a mediatorial approach, that God appoints a mediator who incorporates both sides of the conflict, God and he's man. In judicial reconciliation, the judge has to be distant. He can't have a conflict of interest if he's connected to either of the parties. In Christian, Jesus' approach to reconciliation, he incorporates both sides. He communicates with both sides. He prays to God and he teaches people. And then in the end, the mediator sacrifices his own interest to bring the parties together. Like, isn't that the core of the Christian gospel? Self-sacrificial mediation, as distinct from trying to do it through laws or public policies. And it seems to me if one's a believer and one's engaged in the business of reconciliation, whether it's leading people into a relationship with God this way or trying to reconcile them in the conflicts in society, self-sacrificial mediation is the key. And the other thing about his approach, it's non-coercive. You can't compel people to accept it. I think Jesus' resurrection to me is the evidence that God himself accepted Jesus' self-sacrifice. But whether we do or whether a person we're ministering to, it's actually up to them. So it's non-coercive. In essence, Jesus' approach to reconciliation is an out-of-court settlement, as distinct from the court settlement that you have in the Old Testament. And again, I just think I just want to encourage those of you that are, I think your ministry has this balance that is reflected in Jesus' own ministry of the vertical and horizontal dimensions. And I hope some of these thoughts on reconciliation as being at the core of that ministry, whether we're talking about this dimension or that dimension, may be of help to you. So I think that's probably enough from me. And why don't you, Steve, tell me if there's certain things you'd like to touch on. I'd be more than happy to. Unlike the question period in House of Commons, answers will be given to the, to the questions.
Oh, that's great. Good. I had asked the staff to submit some questions that they might like you to answer, and I've got a couple of those here, and then I've got my whole list that I created. So we're gonna ask my questions. No, actually, there's a good balance here. Preston, one of the things that I do with our new staff is I try to have lunch with everyone who comes to work at the Mustard Seed, and one of the questions I ask them is, tell us a little bit about your faith journey. Now, I would submit that if we let you do that, it would take up the rest of our time. So I'd like to kind of focus on what's God been teaching you specifically over the last couple of years. You've kind of moved into retirement, and sometimes, I notice as I get older, sometimes my perspective changes. So what's God been teaching you lately?
Well, I partly what I talked about there, that reconciliation is just at the core of our Christian ministry and testimony. So one can ask oneself, like, okay, if God's in the world and his work is reconciling, what am I doing in that department today? This emphasis on reconciliation and how the self-sacrificial dimension of it is something that's come to me. Going back a little bit, I was raised in a Christian family, in a Christian church, and as a teenager, I went through what probably a lot of you did. I started to question, like, am I buying into this because I've been culturalized into it by my church or my family, or is this something that's really my own decision? Do I want to make a commitment to Christ on my own? And I went through that struggle, but I never had much difficulty accepting the basic tenets of the Christian faith. My struggles have been with how does it work itself out. And when I started out in university, I started out in physics. I couldn't handle the math, so I went into economics, which tells you something about economics. But so my question was, how does faith relate to science? And then I was in management consulting for 20 years, mainly in the energy industry. And so I was, how does my faith work out in business? We were involved in trying to patch up tensions between Aboriginals and energy companies. So actually, that's when I got into studying reconciliation as a model. And then I got into politics. But then the question was, okay, how does my faith affect my politics? So that's been a lifelong question for me. Not questioning so much the tenets of the Christian faith, except the revelation, the authority of the scriptures, the deity of Christ, and things like that. But how does it work itself out? And that's been my preoccupation.
Good. I think it should be a preoccupation with all of us. How does our
yeah.
faith work out in real life?
Yeah.
The second question here is, how do you reconcile your personal belief system with party policies that are inconsistent with those values?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question that any believer getting into politics will struggle with. First of all, I make a major effort to try to change the policies of the political group that I disagree with. In fact, that's how come I ended up starting two political parties. Didn't agree with the other guys. I think making a strenuous effort to change the policies of a party that you disagree with. A lot of people, when they see there's a policy of a political party that they disagree with, say, well, I won't have anything to do with that bunch. Mm-hmm. Well, but then what you'll do is you'll perpetuate whatever that policy is that you don't agree with. So making a strenuous effort to change that, and then if you're going to run for election, you have to decide. Like as a Democratic representative, there's three things you got to. There's sort of three theories on how that works. There's the trusteeship theory that says you just owe them your vote. There's or that you owe them your conscience, so that you should just vote the way you want to vote. That's the trusteeship. There's the delegate theory that says you're a delegate of these people who elected you, so you should represent their view. And then there's another view that says you represent your party. And the challenge for an elected person is, what do you do when the three of them conflict? What do you do when your views, the party's views, and your constituents' views conflict? The political parties that I was with, the Reform Party, said that in the end of the day, you deferred to the view of your electors. Even if it was different than your own personal view, because they can't stand up in the House of Commons and vote. They can't vote you're their representative. So when I got into these dilemmas where my constituents' view was different than mine, I would engage my constituents is Calgary Southwest, and I would engage and say, I know that the majority of you think this way, but I think it's wrong. And at the end of the day, I'll defer to your judgment. I can't argue your case because I don't believe in it, but I'll stand up and vote for it. But I'm going to try to persuade you that position is not the best, and here's an alternative. And I found if people thought you would defer to their position, often they would end up deferring to yours. So that's how I tried to handle that. And there's different ways of handling that issue. But my caution to people getting into public life is figure that out before you get there, and tell your constituents that. Don't wait until some controversial issue comes up and then say, well, I didn't tell you, but on that I can't. This is rambling on, but on private members' bills in the House of Commons, there's a standing vote. The clerk stands at the head of the House and goes up and down the rows of the seats in the House of Commons, and you stand a yes or no. He's taking the yes vote. You stand if it's a yes. And I've seen guys on some of these issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and euthanasia. The clerk's coming down the row and they're trying to figure out what's my position. Well, that's a little late. Like figure it out before you get there.
Thank you. what do you see as the optimal intersection of government-run social programs and private charity work? And a follow-up question is, what are their roles in the fight against poverty that each government is better suited to fulfill, whether it's government or charity?
Well, that's a huge question, and it could go on for a long time. But take the first one. I think in this country we have tended to assign a very large role to government in the delivery of health, education, and social services. 2/3 of the budgets of these provincial governments, including our own here, are in those three areas. And my own view is that we ought to be aiming towards a mixed social service sector, public and private, with freedom of choice for people to decide which one they want. And with a social contract between the two, that we've got to get to a certain minimal level of services no matter how it's organized. So I'm actually in favor on the healthcare side of a mixed healthcare system, public and private, with freedom of choice. I'm in favor of a mixed educational system, public and private, with freedom of choice, and a mixed social services system in the area where there's both public and private. And the argument becomes what's the best balance between them, not whether it should be all one or all the other. And on the poverty issue, the conventional wisdom in this country is that the way you deal with poverty is through income redistribution through progressive taxation. You take from the wealthy, redistribute it through the government to the poor. Maybe there's a place for that, but I don't think it's worked very well. We've still got a lot of poverty. Another approach, maybe we're talking about two approaches, is a better distribution of the tools of wealth creation. And that's been more the emphasis that I've on. Can you get a better distribution of access to capital through microbanking, for example, through access to markets, by giving poorer people the instruments and tools to create wealth as distinct from just a redistribution of wealth. And so I could get in a long story there, but years ago, for 20 years, I was the president of a community development company up in north central Alberta, Slave Lake Developments, the South Shore of Lesser Slave Lake. In the 60s, a study was done in the province about 7 areas that had not benefited from the general development of Alberta. One of them was that Slave Lake area. So we set up, at the initiative of some local people up there, including some Aboriginal bands, this dual-purpose company. It had an economic objective. It had to earn a return on the capital that was invested, but it had a social objective of undertaking housing projects and things like that in an area that had nothing. To make a long story short, we talked the oil industry into supporting part of it at the beginning, and it went on. They sold that company. The shares were sold at $1 a share to start, but it took 18 months to raise $100,000 because the people that had never owned a share in the company had to explain the whole thing. Anyway, they sold that company in 2016. I was head of it for 20 years, and then I had to give it up. The day after they sold it, they distributed $55 million into the bank accounts of those 300 people, including the Sawridge Aboriginal Band. So that's a different approach, giving people the tools of wealth creation as an approach to dealing with poverty, as distinct from income redistribution. And as in most of these cases, probably the best solution is some kind of balance between the two of them. Yeah.
Thank you.
The Haskayne School here is doing a case history on that Slave Lake developments, and it would be worth reading because it's a model that could be applied elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. How or do you see the role of charities and government relations changing in the next 10 years?
Well, I think there's a tug-of-war going on in the political arena. That there are some people that want the state to play a bigger and bigger role in all of these social areas, in health, in education, and social services, things that the charities do. I think we're approaching the point of diminishing returns. There's a study done by the Montreal Economic Institute on the Quebec healthcare system. In Quebec, the provincial budget, 52% of their budget is committed to healthcare. They can't go much further without robbing the education, social services. So I think we're coming to a limit of what the government can do. So the other approach is to strengthen the role of the non-governmental aid entities and strengthen the role of the charities. Allow charities to raise capital and to pay a return on it, a lower return than you'd get if you were an industry or something. But right now, our charity laws do not permit raising social capital because you can't pay a return on it. So, and I'm actually in favor of a stronger charitable sector and changing the charity laws and the tax laws and the capital formation laws to facilitate that. There's a big debate going on in the political arena. You have to decide kind of what side you're on. I think I could predict what side you might be on, but won't venture there.
Criticism of political leadership is pretty common. How have you learned to deal with constant criticism?
Well, I grew up in a political home. See, my dad became premier in 1940. I was born in 1942. My dad became premier in 1943 and didn't retire until 1968. So I grew up in, and just the constant criticism that is there. One time, my folks had a housekeeper. I hired a housekeeper who was looking after us kids, and she undertook to cut out of the Edmonton Journal all the negative comments on my father because she thought this would impede our development. Well, the newspaper looked like a piece of spaghetti when the legislature was sitting. So I grew up with it, so I never, that never bothered me, and basically my approach was to ignore it. Now there's one danger in that approach, and I share this with younger people. You can become so hardened to any kind of criticism, particularly one that's aimed at getting to you emotionally, because that's what those criticisms are designed to do. When you're in a debate and the other guy's attacking you, what he's really trying to do is to get you to react emotionally, because you'll probably make decisions there that you wouldn't be, that would be unwise. But the trouble with developing that very thick skin is there may be some emotional messages that should get through to you from people close to you, from your family. And if you develop that hardened skin, you may not pick that up. So it's a strategy. I don't know what the alternatives are, but it has its downsides that you should be careful of, yeah. But, you know, my father used to get these threatening letters, and he would throw them in the waste paper basket. And then the RCMP had a deal with his senior secretary to fish them out, and they would go and investigate them. But my father's argument was that the guy you had to worry about was not the guy that wanted to shoot you and had the courtesy to write you, tell you. It was the guy that didn't have the courtesy to write you that you had to worry about. So, yeah.
Okay, here's another one. Starting and leading political parties is pretty heady stuff. How did you remain grounded in the midst of the celebrity?
Well, if you start a new political party in this country, you won't be much of a celebrity. People say, you must be crazy. So, yeah, I never had I was never the subject of Trudeau-mania or anything like that. So our struggle, particularly if you try to innovate politically, you run into just enormous amounts of opposition. It's one of the worries in this country, and it affects your area as well. In Canada, if you come up with a new idea or a better way of doing things, like your whole approach here, the initial reaction of other people is negative, to say, well, why it won't work, or that you can't do it that way. And then Canadians, after a while, may warm up to the idea. We have second thoughts, and the second thoughts are positive. This is one difference between us and Americans. Like, I did work in California and deal with Texans in the oil patch here. The initial reaction of at least Californians and Texans to a new idea is, by golly, that just might work. And then they have their hard second, they have second thoughts too, but they're second. But if you're the innovator, that initial reaction, by golly, this just might work, is so encouraging. So in starting new political parties, I just don't think you get celebrity status that way. You're seen more as an oddball.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I can identify with that. I lived in the U.S. for over 20 years, and most Americans, you give an idea and they say, yeah, let's explore that. Let's move that way, and then the sober second thought is usually, no, that won't work. But in Canada, it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
You make a suggestion, oh, that won't work, and then maybe after some sober second thought, they're more open to saying, we might be able to make that happen.
Yeah, but that positive initial reaction, if you're an innovator, it helps you carry on for another few months. Whereas when it's the wet blanket syndrome in a cold country that can freeze and you can get nowhere.
Okay, we're sort of running out of time. I've got one more question here that I will ask. I have a few left, but one of the things we've been struggling with is this values test for the Canada Summer Jobs. And now, do you see this kind of attestation or affirmation becoming the new standard for receiving government funds?
Well, it depends again on who's in power. I think the more, and I don't want to be political here, but I think the more left of center political parties tend to favor that approach, that tying funding to an attestation that you support some policy position or value of the government. Personally, if I was in the legislature, I would resist that and say you should not tie things of that nature together. I actually think this attestation requirement of the summer jobs program, eventually that will be tested in the courts. And I think it will be rejected on the grounds that it interferes with the first 6 fundamental freedoms guaranteed in the Charter, which are freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, freedom of belief, and freedom of expression. On a little bit the funny side, I'm preparing a 1-page attestation thing of my own. So when the Liberal candidate knocks on my door during the election, I say, "Oh, I've got an attestation thing. If you want this job in the Parliament, you got to sign this attestation of your commitment to fundamental freedoms." So.
Well, thank you. Well,
I'll share that with anybody that wants it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to share your thoughts. And I'm sure there's lots more questions, but we only have a certain amount of time. But before we finish, we have a little gift. Oh, it's over here. These are our famous mustard seed socks. So hopefully you'll wear them with pride.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And before we go, let me just close in a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity we have to come together to talk about our faith. We thank you for the freedom we have to do that. We thank you for Preston and his willingness to be here and to share his thoughts with us, and we do pray a blessing on him. Ask, Lord, that you continue to use him to accomplish your good and perfect will in this world. And so we thank you for this time we've had, and we do bless you, God. In Christ's name, amen.